It all started with a seemingly ordinary day, just another routine flight with passengers quietly boarding, expecting nothing more than a smooth journey to their destinations. Everyone had a ticket, a seat assignment, and a small sense of confidence that the airline staff would ensure order and fairness. But in that atmosphere of assumed normalcy, a mistake was about to occur, one that would change the entire dynamic of the flight, and the lives of those involved, in ways no one could predict. Among the passengers, there was one individual who appeared unassuming, blending into the crowd, carrying nothing that screamed wealth, status, or influence. His demeanor was calm, polite, and in every way ordinary. Yet, beneath that calm exterior, there was a presence that commanded respect, a presence that would soon turn the tables in a dramatic fashion. The confusion began subtly. A steward approached with a clipboard, glancing back and forth between passengers, trying to enforce a decision that had already been made without much thought. A seat had been flagged, a passenger supposedly in the wrong place, and the staff were determined to correct what they believed to be an error. Their approach was confident, almost arrogant, as if authority alone could justify any action. There was no hesitation in their tone, no questioning of their judgment. They saw a man seated in what they considered a restricted area, assumed he had made a mistake or, worse, had no right to be there, and decided immediately that he needed to be removed. There was no dialogue, no attempt to understand, just the assumption that their authority granted them insight into who belonged and who did not. As they gestured for him to leave, a subtle tension began to ripple through the cabin. Fellow passengers noticed the interaction, some curious, some uneasy. The man did not rise immediately. He remained seated, composed, exuding a quiet strength that was both confusing and unnerving to those around him. His calm refusal to comply with what he perceived as an unjust action introduced the first crack in the illusion of control the staff had so confidently projected. The situation, which could have been resolved with a simple verification or polite inquiry, escalated rapidly because the wrong assumptions had been made. The staff had removed him based on appearances and assumptions, not facts. And in that moment, the true error became apparent: they had targeted the wrong passenger. What followed was a mixture of disbelief, tension, and the initial spark of conflict that would define the remainder of the flight. The man's presence in that seat was no accident, no oversight, it was deliberate, authorized, and in fact, his right to be there was absolute. The mistake, however, had already been made. The staff had acted, publicly and decisively, in a way that humiliated him in front of the other passengers. They believed they were enforcing rules, but in reality, they had misjudged the situation entirely. And the subtle but unmistakable glimmer in the man's eyes hinted that this error would not go unanswered. What seemed like a simple logistical mistake was about to become a lesson in misjudgment, one that would carry consequences far beyond the immediate moment. From the perspective of the removed passenger, there was an immediate surge of indignation. The sense of injustice was palpable. He was not only wrongly accused but also publicly embarrassed, singled out in front of a crowd of strangers who had no context for the error. Each step he was asked to take felt heavier, not because of the physical movement, but because of the weight of assumption and authority pressing down on him. He remained composed outwardly, carefully controlling his words and reactions, knowing that a hasty response could escalate the situation further. Internally, however, the gears were turning. Every slight, every judgment, and every misstep of the airline staff was being logged, remembered, and analyzed. The wrong passenger was not just a victim in this scenario, he was an observer, noting each detail and quietly preparing for a response that would be both precise and impactful. The staff, in their certainty, failed to recognize the depth of their error. They assumed compliance would be immediate and unquestioned. They did not see the calm calculation behind the man's demeanor, did not sense the power and influence he carried quietly beneath the surface. Each gesture they made to enforce their mistake only added to the tension in the cabin. Other passengers began to sense that something was off, that perhaps the person being removed was not at fault, that perhaps the authority figures were acting prematurely. Whispers and sideways glances traveled down the rows. The initial shock of the removal attempt was giving way to a slow-burning awareness among those watching that the wrong person had been singled out. The wrong passenger, quietly seated moments before, became the central figure of attention. The error was no longer just a procedural misstep, it had transformed into a narrative of injustice that would demand attention and, eventually, reckoning. Each attempt by the staff to assert control, each gesture to remove him, only reinforced the growing tension and anticipation of what would come next. There was no visible confrontation yet, but the atmosphere had shifted. The cabin was no longer just a neutral space for travel, it had become the stage for a drama fueled by error, assumption, and the subtle power of one man who had been wrongly removed. Underestimation is a dangerous mistake, one that often hides in plain sight until the moment it strikes with full force. In this story, the airline staff, confident in their authority and quick to judge, made precisely that error. They assumed that the passenger they had targeted was powerless, ordinary, and entirely without influence or the capacity to respond. Their certainty was so absolute that they did not pause to question their assumptions, did not pause to consider that appearances can be deceiving. From the very beginning, they treated him as a problem to be removed rather than a human being deserving of fairness. That single misjudgment, born of arrogance and a lack of insight, set the stage for a series of consequences that none of them could have anticipated. Underestimation, in this case, was not a minor lapse, it was the catalyst for an unfolding drama that would expose the flaws in their judgment and the fragility of their authority. The passenger, on the other hand, was fully aware of the misjudgment being made. He recognized, immediately, that they had evaluated him based solely on superficial factors, his appearance, the seat he occupied, perhaps even the assumptions about his demeanor. They saw what they expected to see, not what was true. This awareness, however, was coupled with a deliberate restraint. He did not react impulsively or angrily, he did not give them the satisfaction of seeing fear or frustration in his eyes. Instead, he observed, he calculated, and he prepared. When someone underestimates you, it is the perfect opportunity to demonstrate, with precision and control, that their assumptions were not only incorrect but dangerously short-sighted. He understood that the weight of authority can feel invincible, but only when it is unchallenged. A misjudgment, however, creates vulnerability, and he intended to exploit that vulnerability carefully. As the situation unfolded, it became increasingly clear to the other passengers that the airline staff had miscalculated. The confidence with which they attempted to enforce their error now seemed fragile, bordering on desperation. Every command they issued, every insistence that he leave, was met with quiet composure rather than resistance, and that composure only amplified the tension. The more they assumed they were in control, the more they revealed the weakness of their assumption. Underestimation has a peculiar way of disguising its danger, it lulls people into believing they are untouchable until the consequences manifest. Here, the consequences were quietly building, almost imperceptibly at first, but with increasing intensity, like a storm gathering on the horizon. It is often said that the first mistake is rarely the most consequential, rather, it is the chain reaction it sets off that proves disastrous. The airline staff, having underestimated the passenger, unwittingly created a situation that escalated far beyond their control. Each attempt to assert authority in the wrong direction only served to highlight the error, turning a small misstep into a growing spectacle. Underestimation blinds people to the potential within others, the hidden strengths, and the capacity for response. In this case, the passenger's calm exterior masked a depth of preparation and awareness that would soon force a reckoning. The staff's assumptions acted like fuel, intensifying the outcome they believed they were preventing. From a psychological standpoint, underestimation breeds overconfidence. The staff believed that their decision was correct, that the passenger had no means to challenge them, and that any resistance could be ignored. Overconfidence, however, is the natural companion of underestimation. It clouds judgment and narrows perception. They fail to consider that someone who is underestimated often operates with greater awareness precisely because they are underestimated. Every gesture, every order, every attempt to remove him was being observed and mentally recorded, creating a blueprint for the precise moment when the consequences would unfold. The underestimated individual has the advantage of surprise, the power of preparation, and the clarity of seeing the error that others fail to notice. In the cabin, the atmosphere shifted subtly as the tension grew. Passengers sensed that something was amiss, that the initial confidence of the staff might have been misplaced. The wrong decisions were made visible in the way the staff interacted with the man, in the brief hesitations and awkward pauses that betrayed their uncertainty. Underestimation often blinds people to these small but telling signs, and that is exactly what happened here. They did not see the subtle indicators of strength and influence in the passenger's demeanor. They did not see the potential for a response that would not only correct the mistake but also assert authority in a way that reversed the imbalance. Their oversight was not just an error in judgment, it was an invitation for consequences to manifest. The passenger, fully aware of their assumptions, began to take strategic steps, not out of anger but out of precision. Every word he spoke, every motion he made, was calculated to highlight their misjudgment. The underestimated individual has a distinct advantage, the power of timing. Acting too soon diminishes the effect, acting too late can miss the opportunity entirely. Here, timing was everything. By remaining calm and measured, he ensured that the moment of reckoning would be unmistakable, undeniable, and profoundly instructive. The consequences of underestimation were now moving from the realm of potential into reality, growing more intense with each passing second as the staff continued to operate under the false assumption that they remained in control. Power and respect are two of the most fragile elements in any social interaction, yet they are often treated as if they are immutable, unquestionable, or guaranteed. On this particular flight, both were put to the test in ways that none of the airline staff could have anticipated. They assumed that their position and authority granted them the unquestioned right to make decisions, to enforce rules, and to assert control over anyone who appeared to be in violation. Yet power that is assumed without understanding, and respect that is demanded without earning, can collapse in an instant when confronted with someone who possesses the quiet strength to challenge it. The passenger they removed, or attempted to remove, was calm, composed, and observant. He understood that true power is not about loud declarations or aggressive action, it is about presence, timing, and the ability to make others recognize, without question, that respect is due. Their authority, which had seemed absolute at first, was about to face a test that would reveal its limitations. From the moment the initial misjudgment occurred, the balance of power in the cabin shifted in subtle but undeniable ways. The staff, believing themselves to be in full control, acted with a confidence that bordered on arrogance. They gave orders, gestured sharply, and insisted upon compliance, fully expecting the passenger to bow to their authority without question. Yet he did not respond in the way they anticipated. Instead, he remained seated, poised, and unflinching, radiating a presence that quietly demanded acknowledgement. There is a remarkable difference between someone who submits to authority and someone who commands respect despite it. In this moment, the airline staff began to sense, though perhaps not fully understand, that the power they assumed was not as absolute as they had believed. Every gesture they made to assert dominance only served to expose their overconfidence and their lack of insight into the situation. Respect, like power, is not something that can be mandated. It must be recognized, earned, or at the very least, acknowledged. By attempting to remove him, the staff demonstrated a lack of respect that was immediately apparent to both the passenger and the surrounding audience. Fellow travelers, initially passive observers, began to notice the imbalance. They saw a man being treated unjustly, a man whose composure and confidence contrasted sharply with the flustered, uncertain movements of the staff. Power and respect are intertwined. One cannot exist sustainably without the other. Authority exercised without respect is fragile, and in this scenario, that fragility was becoming increasingly evident. The passenger's silent challenge was more potent than any verbal confrontation. It was a quiet assertion that power imposed by assumption alone is temporary and vulnerable to correction. As the situation escalated, the dynamic between the staff and the passenger became a microcosm of a larger truth. Those who underestimate the ability of others to command respect risk undermining their own power. The staff continued their attempts to enforce their version of order, but each intervention only highlighted their miscalculation. The passenger's steady gaze, his unshaken posture, and his calm demeanor communicated an unspoken message. Respect is earned through action and character, not granted automatically to those with a uniform or title. This message resonated not only with the staff but with the surrounding passengers, who began to recognize the injustice taking place. In such moments, the true measure of authority is revealed, not through assertion, but through the recognition of fairness, judgment, and competence. Their failure to understand this distinction was a fundamental error, one that would soon have repercussions far beyond the immediate scenario. The passenger's response was both deliberate and strategic. He understood that testing power and respect is not about confrontation for its own sake but about demonstrating the consequences of overreach and misjudgment. By remaining composed, he forced the staff to confront their own assumptions and to recognize that their authority had limits they had not anticipated. The energy in the cabin, initially ordinary and routine, now carried the weight of observation and judgment. Every passenger was subconsciously measuring the exchange, noticing the disparity between assumed authority and actual respect. Power, once thought to be absolute, was now under scrutiny, and respect, once presumed, was being demanded. The wrong passenger, in essence, had become the arbiter of what was truly deserved, revealing that power without respect is unstable and that authority can be challenged, not through chaos, but through quiet, deliberate presence. The airline staff, despite their confidence, began to feel the subtle pressure of this test. Their orders became sharper, their gestures more insistent, and yet each action only served to reinforce the growing perception of their misjudgment. The passengers' calm demeanor acted as a mirror, reflecting their overconfidence and exposing the cracks in their assumed authority. In testing power and respect, one must recognize that influence is not a commodity to be wielded at will, it is a relationship between action, perception, and acknowledgement. The passenger's quiet control highlighted this dynamic perfectly, showing that respect, once lost or ignored, must be reclaimed through strategic action and undeniable presence. The staff's failure to recognize this was a critical misstep, one that shifted the balance of power even further in his favor. Beyond the immediate interactions, the incident served as a reminder that power is not only tested by the actions one takes but by the resistance one faces. Those who assume authority without understanding its limits often discover, too late, that respect cannot be coerced and influence cannot be assumed. The passenger, with his calm awareness, strategic patience, and silent assertion, became the measure of true power in the cabin. Each moment, each subtle movement, each quiet observation was a demonstration of the principle that genuine authority is recognized by others, not declared unilaterally. The airline staff, in their overconfidence and misjudgment, had created the perfect conditions for that recognition to occur, setting the stage for consequences that would be unavoidable and profound. Clever, calculated revenge is never impulsive. It is deliberate, strategic, and precise, built upon careful observation and a clear understanding of timing. In this story, the passenger who had been wrongly targeted understood this principle intuitively. He recognized that the airline staff had acted hastily, relying on assumptions and superficial judgments. They had humiliated him, attempted to remove him, and displayed an overconfidence that bordered on arrogance. Yet he did not respond immediately with anger or confrontation. Instead, he measured the situation, taking note of every detail, the way the staff communicated, the subtle reactions of other passengers, and the gaps in the system they believed they controlled. Revenge, he knew, is most powerful when it is calculated, when every move is anticipated and executed with precision. A hasty response may feel satisfying in the moment, but it rarely produces the kind of impact that a carefully orchestrated plan can achieve. From the beginning, his strategy was rooted in observation. He watched the airline staff carefully, noting their patterns, the ways in which they asserted authority, and the small inconsistencies that revealed their lack of preparation. Every gesture they made, every command they issued, became part of a mental map, a blueprint for how he would turn the tables. Clever revenge is never reactive, it is proactive, built upon knowledge and foresight. He understood that the wrong passenger is not powerless simply because others assume so. In fact, underestimation is the perfect opportunity for a calculated response. By remaining calm, patient, and aware, he ensured that when the time came to act, his response would not only correct the injustice but also make it unforgettable. Timing was critical. He knew that revenge, no matter how clever, loses its potency if executed too soon or too late. The moment had to be right, the audience ready to witness, and the impact undeniable. In the confined space of the airplane cabin, every movement, every word, carried weight. He leveraged these constraints to his advantage, turning what might have been a small, personal act into a situation that revealed the consequences of misjudgment to all those present. The airline staff, unaware of his strategic thinking, continued to operate under the illusion of control. Each attempt to assert authority only added fuel to the eventual revelation. Revenge, in its most effective form, is not chaos, it is precision under pressure, a demonstration that control can be regained through intelligence, not brute force. The psychological dimension of clever revenge is as important as the physical or procedural elements. The passenger understood that embarrassment and exposure are powerful tools when used correctly. By allowing the staff to display their overconfidence and arrogance, he created the conditions for their own misstep to become apparent. Their actions, intended to assert dominance, instead highlighted their error, providing the perfect setup for a strategic response. Clever revenge often relies on the miscalculations of others, turning their own mistakes into instruments of consequence. In this case, the misjudgment of the airline staff became the very mechanism through which the passenger would reclaim authority, dignity, and respect. Preparation was key. Before taking any overt action, he considered the potential outcomes, anticipating how the staff might react, how passengers might perceive the situation, and how the balance of authority could be shifted. Every calculated move depended on foresight, patience, and a clear understanding of human behavior. He knew that a rushed or emotional response would undermine the impact, while a deliberate, measured approach would ensure that the consequences were undeniable and instructive. Clever, calculated revenge is not about satisfying ego in the moment, it is about demonstrating, through action, that misjudgment carries consequences that cannot be ignored. The staff's arrogance provided the perfect conditions for such a demonstration, but only if executed with precision. In the cabin, the tension began to shift imperceptibly. Other passengers, initially passive observers, started to sense that the situation was more complex than it seemed. The passenger's calm demeanor, his quiet awareness, and the subtle confidence he projected began to draw attention. Clever revenge often relies on perception as much as action. By remaining composed, he not only maintained control over his own response but also influenced how others perceived the unfolding events. The airline staff, still unaware of the brewing consequences, continued their attempts to assert authority, inadvertently setting themselves up for the calculated response that was imminent. The wrong passenger, once victimized, now held the potential to reshape the narrative entirely. Every detail mattered. The timing of words, the choice of gestures, the subtle signals sent to both staff and passengers, all were elements in the execution of revenge that was as psychological as it was procedural. Clever, calculated revenge requires an understanding that power is often revealed not in confrontation, but in the ability to guide perception, to expose error, and to assert control subtly yet unmistakably. The passenger recognized that his actions, carefully timed and precisely delivered, would not only rectify the immediate injustice but also send a clear message about the dangers of underestimation. The more the staff attempted to maintain control, the more obvious their mistake became, reinforcing the effectiveness of the passenger's strategy. In situations like this, clever revenge transforms the ordinary into the extraordinary. What might have been a simple incident of misjudgment became a staged demonstration of insight, foresight, and quiet authority. Every calculated move, every measured response, was designed to ensure that the consequences were not only felt but remembered. The passenger's strategy was clear: turn the mistake into a lesson, the arrogance into exposure, and the misjudgment into undeniable evidence of who truly held the power. By the time the moment of response arrived, it would be both inevitable and irreversible, the result of careful planning and unshakable patience. Public humiliation is a form of consequence that carries weight far beyond the immediate moment, for it exposes mistakes, arrogance, and misjudgment to an audience that amplifies their impact. In this particular flight, the airline staff had assumed that their authority would go unquestioned, that their actions in removing the passenger would be accepted without scrutiny. They believed that the decision was final, that their position alone granted them unquestioned power, and that no one would challenge their judgment. Yet in targeting the wrong passenger, they had unknowingly set the stage for a public lesson that would reveal their errors to everyone present. Humiliation, when executed subtly and strategically, does not require loud confrontation. It is the exposure of misjudgment and the reversal of assumptions that makes it unforgettable. The wrong passenger, once a victim of their overconfidence, was poised to turn their miscalculation into a spectacle that would leave a lasting impression on all who witnessed it. From the moment the mistake was made, the staff's attempts to assert authority were inherently visible to the other passengers. Air travel is a confined space, where the audience is immediate and unavoidable. Every gesture, every sharp command, every insistence that the passenger comply was observed, noted, and interpreted by the people around them. In this environment, the wrong move becomes amplified. The more aggressively they attempted to enforce their error, the more apparent their misjudgment became. Public humiliation relies on this amplification. It transforms a private mistake into a visible, undeniable reality. The passenger, aware of the audience and the consequences of their overreach, used their composure and strategic timing to ensure that the staff's arrogance would be exposed in full view, leaving no room for denial or rationalization. There is a profound psychological element to public humiliation. The offenders, in their confidence, had assumed that no one would challenge their authority, that their position would protect them from scrutiny. But when their error became apparent to the onlookers, their authority began to erode in real time. Each passenger watching began to perceive the imbalance, to notice the injustice, and to recognize the power of the wronged individual. Public humiliation is effective precisely because it is witnessed. It is a social and psychological mechanism that forces recognition of fault, often more effectively than private confrontation. In this case, the wrong passenger leveraged the situation to turn observation into consequence, ensuring that the staff's actions were judged not only by him but by everyone present. The impact of public humiliation extends beyond the immediate actors. Fellow passengers, initially passive, began to realize that the narrative they were observing was not what it seemed. The calm demeanor of the passenger, combined with the staff's increasingly awkward attempts to assert control, highlighted the misjudgment in a way that was impossible to ignore. The audience's perception shifted from passive curiosity to active awareness. Humiliation, when public, relies on this shift. The wrong actions of the staff became a spectacle, a lesson in overconfidence, misjudgment, and the perils of underestimating others. The confined space of the airplane cabin, initially ordinary and routine, now served as a stage for a psychological lesson in accountability. Execution is key in the orchestration of public humiliation. The passenger did not need to shout, argue, or create a scene. Instead, he relied on his composure, his timing, and the undeniable facts of the situation. Every hesitant gesture by the staff, every faltering assertion of authority, became a marker of their error. The audience, watching closely, began to understand that the passenger's presence was justified and that the removal attempt was entirely mistaken. Public humiliation is most effective when it is evident without explanation, when the actions of the wrongdoers reveal the truth in plain sight. In this case, the staff's own behavior became the instrument of their exposure, while the passenger maintained a quiet, strategic control that magnified the effect. The consequences of public humiliation are often long-lasting because they are anchored in memory. Those who witness injustice and its correction tend to remember not only the events but also the manner in which power and respect were challenged. The passenger, by allowing the staff's error to be visible, ensured that the lesson was clear. Arrogance and misjudgment have consequences that are not easily forgotten. Humiliation in this context served a dual purpose. It corrected the immediate wrong and reinforced the broader principle that authority is not absolute, that mistakes, especially those made in public, carry a weight that extends far beyond the private realm. Every passenger became a witness to the reversal of fortune, an observer to the subtle but undeniable assertion of dignity and control. Public humiliation also serves as a deterrent, though its power is often underestimated. By exposing the staff's error so visibly, the passenger ensured that similar behavior would be reconsidered in the future. The memory of being wrong, of overestimating one's authority, and of facing the quiet yet undeniable consequence of misjudgment creates a lasting impact. The lesson is reinforced not only through the immediate embarrassment but also through the social acknowledgement that accompanies it. In this way, public humiliation is not merely punitive, it is instructive. The wrong passenger, through strategic patience and careful observation, transformed the initial injustice into a teaching moment for both the offenders and everyone watching. Judging by appearances is one of the most common human errors, and one of the most dangerous. It is easy to glance at someone, to make assumptions based on clothing, demeanor, or perceived social status, and to believe that those assumptions are accurate reflections of reality. Yet appearances are only a surface layer, often masking intelligence, capability, influence, and character. On this particular flight, the airline staff fell into this very trap. They saw a man who did not conform to their expectations, who did not look like someone deserving of a specific seat or recognition, and they acted decisively to remove him. In doing so, they relied on superficial judgments rather than verifying facts or exercising careful thought. This error, seemingly minor at first glance, would become the catalyst for a profound lesson that none of them would forget. From the passenger's perspective, the situation was both familiar and infuriating. He had likely encountered such assumptions many times before, people underestimating him based on outward appearances alone. Yet he understood that those who judge hastily rarely anticipate the consequences of their errors. He did not react impulsively, he did not confront the staff with anger. Instead, he allowed the situation to unfold, letting their misjudgment reveal itself through their own actions. There is a subtle power in restraint, particularly when others assume they are in control. By remaining calm, composed, and observant, he created the perfect conditions for their assumptions to unravel, demonstrating quietly yet unmistakably that appearances can be deceiving and that underestimation often carries consequences. The other passengers in the cabin became unwitting witnesses to this lesson. At first, many may have shared the staff's assumptions, seeing only a man being asked to leave, not understanding why he was being singled out. But as the scenario developed, it became increasingly clear that something was amiss. The wrong passenger was not the one in error, the error lay with those who had judged him hastily. By observing his composure and the staff's faltering attempts to justify their actions, the audience began to understand the broader principle at play. Judging by appearances is not only unfair, it is often inaccurate, and the consequences of such judgments can be profound and public. The cabin, initially a place of routine and anonymity, became a stage for an enduring demonstration of this truth. In moments like this, the error of judging by appearances is magnified. The airline staff had assumed authority, believing their decision to be both correct and unquestionable. They failed to consider that the passenger's presence in the seat was entirely justified, that his demeanor and outward appearance were not indicators of incompetence or inferiority. Every gesture they made to enforce their misjudgment only highlighted the discrepancy between perception and reality. Judging by appearances is particularly dangerous when combined with authority because it creates a false sense of security. The staff assumed that their decision would go unchallenged, that the audience would accept their authority at face value, and that no consequences would follow. In reality, their superficial judgment was the very foundation of the impending lesson. The passenger, aware of the assumptions being made, used them to his advantage. By remaining calm and collected, he allowed the staff's misjudgment to become increasingly evident. Every attempt they made to assert authority, every insistence that he leave the seat, became a reflection of their error rather than his behavior. Cleverly, he turned their assumptions into a mirror, showing them, and everyone watching, the flaw in their judgment. Lessons in not judging by appearances are most effective when they are self-evident, when the consequences unfold naturally from the initial error. The more the staff insisted on their assumptions, the more visible their mistake became, reinforcing the lesson for both them and the observers around them. The psychological impact of judging by appearances is significant. When people act on superficial assumptions, they often fail to recognize the deeper qualities of those they judge: intelligence, experience, influence, and resilience. In this scenario, the passenger's quiet strength and strategic awareness contrasted sharply with the staff's rushed decisions and overconfidence. The discrepancy was undeniable, making the lesson all the more powerful. Those who rely on appearances alone risk underestimating others, miscalculating situations, and ultimately facing consequences that are entirely avoidable. By the time the staff realized the depth of their error, it was too late to mitigate the embarrassment or the broader implications of their misjudgment. This situation also illustrates the broader social consequences of judging by appearances. The other passengers, now fully aware of the error, understood that initial impressions can be misleading. They witnessed firsthand how assumptions based on looks, demeanor, or superficial traits can lead to injustice. The lesson extended beyond the immediate interaction between the passenger and the staff. It became a shared understanding among all observers that appearances are not reliable indicators of ability, character, or entitlement. Judging by appearances is a human tendency, but it can have far-reaching and lasting consequences, particularly when reinforced by authority or applied in public spaces. The wrong passenger's response exemplified the best approach to correcting such errors. By exercising patience, awareness, and strategic calm, he allowed the lesson to unfold organically. There was no need for confrontation or aggression. The staff's own actions, combined with the passenger's composure, revealed the truth. Judging by appearances is often a mistake of perception rather than intention, and correcting it requires clarity, patience, and the ability to highlight the disparity between assumption and reality. The passenger transformed what could have been a personal indignity into a public teaching moment, illustrating powerfully that outward appearances are rarely an accurate reflection of capability or worth. In the confined space of the airplane cabin, the lesson in not judging by appearances was amplified. The passengers became witnesses to the unfolding truth, the staff experienced the consequences of their error in real time, and the passenger quietly asserted both his dignity and his authority. Every gesture, every moment of observation, and every reaction contributed to a narrative that exposed the dangers of superficial judgment. By the time the situation reached its peak, the lesson was unmistakable: appearances are deceiving, assumptions are unreliable, and underestimating someone based solely on what is visible is a mistake that can carry profound consequences.